Hey guys, let's continue and we're going to talk about the types of exception that exist. And this is going to be useful for when we create our own custom exceptions and when we code and some classes, such as let's say the scanner, have potential potentially could throw an exception. Let's say as an example, this next ent. You could see here that it could throw a couple different types of exception. We need to be able to understand what type of exception it is and how we could handle those, or even be able to create our own custom exceptions. So to start this out, you'll notice that I'm going to talk about some topics that we haven't covered yet, such as inheritance and a bit of polymorphism. This is fine at our level. We're going to learn it right after we talk about exceptions. But for now, I want to just talk about this and don't stress too much about inheritance or polymorphism if we do mention them or you see them, even though you don't know what it is. No worries, no stress. Let's get into it. The first thing we need to know, there is a built-in class in Java that deals with all exceptions, and that's called throwable class. Inside the throwable class, there is two subclasses of it that are the two categories or types of the two categories of exception, let's say. The first one is called the error. And this is not something we're going to deal with because it handles more of the low level of the JVM stuff, more of the computer stuff, such as, let's say, the Stack Overflow type of issue or something similar. Something that has nothing to do with our current level. So we're not going to talk about it yet. We're going to come back to it later when we get into more low level stuff. The other one is called exception. And this is the one we need to focus. We're going to focus on the exception and a derived class of exception called RuntimeException. Why are these two classes are the ones that we need to focus? Because there is two types where we're going to do and talk about, which is called the unchecked exception for the runtime, and for the exception, which is called a checked exceptions, right? So these are the two classes that are important to us. So what does it mean, checked exception and unchecked exception? Well, let's start talking with the unchecked exception. The last example, the last video, we were talking about these exceptions that could be thrown, right? Like, let's say I run this, and here it's asking to enter an integer, but I enter a word. And I press enter, and you notice we got an exception thrown to us. In this case, it's called input mismatch. This is called a unchecked exception. Why? Because the compiler knows that this type of issue could happen and you know about it, but you don't need to deal with it. This is the important part. You don't need to manage that type of error. These are called unchecked. So you do whatever you want, you know it's going to be thrown, right? If we look at scanner next ent control Q here, let's actually clear my screen for 1 second, clear all drawing. We do control Q on our next ent, you'll notice that it does throw this type of exception. However, the compiler doesn't need us to deal with it, at least not yet. The other type of exception we talked about was the checked exception. This time we're forced to deal with it because it's something that we cannot avoid. It's an error that's more likely to happen, let's say. So how would that one look like? Let's go ahead. Well, before we start coding, other such checked exceptions we have is like, well, the one I'm going to do right now is going to be like the file is not found. What if the scanner was not utilizing the system IO, but it was utilizing, let's say, a file? But if that file doesn't exist, that's an issue that could happen, right? There's other stuff that's more related to, you know, our connection is not made and etc. Those we need to handle. So I'm going to show you these two types of, well, you just saw runtime exception. Let's look at some checked exception. So for a checked exception here, rather than giving it, so let's actually go on scanner for a second. You'll notice there's an overload of scanner. And the one we're currently using is the input stream for the IO. But you could see there's other stuff that we could utilize, input stream, etc., etc. The one I want to utilize is a file. So we could create a file. We're going to talk about this maybe a bit later. And we could say new file, and over here, Control P, we could give the path to where that file exists. So like the first one, string path name. So let's say C // users, I don't know, something. Okay. TXT. Did I do something wrong? / here. There we go. So we talked about escape characters. I need backslashes, but I put it there. Not even sure if this is the correct. I sometimes mix it Unix and Linux. The difference is / or /. Doesn't matter. Moving on. So here I created a file. Let me take off my screen. So here I specified a file. We don't know if that file exists yet. This dsa.txt, I don't know if it exists. And then I'm going to pass that file to my scanner. Now, the moment I do this, we get an error. And this is not because I'm misutilizing it. The problem is I'm not handling the exception that would happen if the file is not found. Okay? So this is a checked exception where we're forced to deal with it before moving on. Now, there's two ways of dealing with it. I'm going to show you the bad way, and then we're going to go in the next video. In the next video, we'll deal with it fully. The bad way is to not deal at all with it and just let the next user, let's say, of this method deal with it. So what does that mean? That means over here on my main method, on the signature, we're going to say it throws, and we could do a control space to get the specific exception we want. In this case, if we read here, it says file not found exception. So we could right here say throws file not found. Oops, I mistyped it. File not found exception. And the moment I do that, you'll notice the error is gone. Is this a good thing to do? No, this is an actual really bad thing to do here. This throws file not found exception is to let whoever is calling main to deal with it. So they have to deal with it. The same way scanner, if we look at this one, if we hold control and click on it, you'll notice it says it throws file not found exception. What this does is to give the responsibility of dealing with this issue to whoever calls scanner. And in this case, in the case of the scanner, it makes sense because I'm the programmer that specified this file. If this file doesn't exist, I should be the one to say what should be the next step. Not scanner, it doesn't know that. But in my case, rather than managing that error, I said my main method, it will throw this file not found exception, and whoever calls main method should deal with it. But who is it that's dealing with the main method? Right? No one. It's the entry point to our program. So what I'm doing here is I'm just throwing it in the air like an idiot. And the moment I run it, well, obviously it's going to crash because this file doesn't exist. And you could see we got that error and no one taken care of it. So this is a really bad thing to do, right? Because you could always throw it to the next guy and eventually no one's dealt with it and it comes back in our face like you see over here. So you should only do this little throws when you want the caller to deal with this problem that could happen. You don't want to utilize this otherwise. Otherwise, you're misusing it and this is an issue. So now if we don't use this throws, the next way is to handle it. And I'll see you guys in the next video to handle this type of issue.